good afternoon, or morning, or night, or 2 a.m. and you can't sleep, you have insomnia, because I have no idea when you're watching this, but I'm recording it in the afternoon, so we'll stick with that. Today we're going to look at the Great War. Europe looks over the abyss, 1914 to 1918. The Great War, of course, is not saying, hey, what a great war. This is a reference to its size. It was the largest war in human history up until that point anyway. Frighteningly, World War II, which you know we're going to get to, dwarfs World War I in its destructive capacity. But at the time, this was the granddaddy of all wars. Europe looks over the abyss, a phrase commonly attached to this war. I don't know where it originated, but there's reason to say this. There's a lot of scholars even today that don't see a lot of point to the war, at least on the Western Front. Somewhat different in the other fronts, particularly in the East. But the trench warfare that we're going to get into on the Western Front seems pointless today. And so this looks like Europe committing suicide. And in some ways that may have been true. So, and it was hard to reconcile what happened here with traditional European Enlightenment values of reason, science, etc., after the war was over. So this really not only shook things up politically, economically, but culturally, psychologically as well. This would have long-term repercussions, to put it mildly. What follows in this unit will be cut into three pieces: the three C's: causes, conduct, consequences. This isn't a new or innovative formulation. This is used all the time for wars. But so in today's segment, we'll talk about the causes or origins of the war, how and why did it come about in the first place. In the next segment, we'll look at conduct, which means the actual war itself, some of the military operations, what life was like in the trenches. We'll focus some attention on the other theaters of war as well, the front in Italy, the front in the Middle East, in Turkey, on the Eastern Front, Russia, but most of our attention will be focused here. The picture here is of the now well-known trench warfare, which was somewhat unique on the Western Front in Flanders and France from 1914 to 1918. Then we'll look at the consequences of the war, and kind of two things there to note. One, we'll try to understand what happened in the peace conference or conferences at the end of the war, the Paris peace talks of 1919 and the resulting Treaty of Versailles, which is really important in understanding the origins of the Second World War. Some of you may already know that. But also consequences in terms of how this changed the outlook, the viewpoint of Europeans after, on the other side of this incredibly destructive war, how it changed worldview and values as well. So today, causes. In August of 1914, when Europe was on the brink of war, the beginning of that month, one country after another started declaring war, and it became inevitable at that point that a conflict would ensue. But not everybody thought this was going to be a disaster or a long, extremely costly war. Some thought that this leaders and populace alike thought it's going to be an exciting war. Last several weeks, we home by Christmas, which is actually said from August to Christmas isn't that long, and it'll be just a great a great story we can tell our kids when we get older. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, was one of those who wasn't buying that rosy outlook, and he ended up being correct. There were others, but they tended to be few and far between, especially people that had the kind of power and position in society that he had. And he said in a famous written statement, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. I can't see them being lit again in our time," saying this is going to be a incredibly brutal, destructive war, and not just in human lives and costs in terms of money, but it's going to change things dramatically in our civilization. And of course, he ended up being prophetic and right, showing quite a bit of wisdom here. Ironically, as we'll see, he's one of the reasons the war happened in the first place, through errors that he made as Foreign Secretary on the British side. He was an able, capable leader with lots of experience, but even capable people can make mistakes, and he made some big ones here, but he wasn't alone. So, in fact, we'll take a special look at this, but there was a lot of bungling in every foreign office, in every government in Europe, in the 5-week period, roughly, between the famous assassination that we'll look at shortly and the outbreak of war at the beginning of August. And there it is, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We're calling this the spark that led to war. So within my causes, conduct, consequences layout framework, within the causes framework, we have the spark, we have the fuel, and then we have the crisis. And the spark and the fuel are related in the following way. This event here certainly triggered the war. This is what set all of the governments in motion, wrangling and frantically trying to find a way to settle this diplomatically, peacefully, over about 5 weeks, and they failed. But spark implies that this really isn't a cause of the war. The causes were already there, at least the long-term causes are already there, and the other causal agents happened after the assassination in that 5-week period of this sort of hot back and forth between this country's representatives and that. But the spark ignited the long-term fuel, the features of the war that had been building for a long time, which we're going to get into next. So that is to say, this was just the spark, not really the cause. If you think of the the long-term causes as fuel, like a big fuel tank, gas tank, if you light a match and throw it into the gas tank, it explodes. If you light a match and throw it into a totally empty tank of nothing, it doesn't explode. It just goes out. So it required the spark to set the fuel, the kindling, whatever metaphor you want to use, aflame. So the spark, set all these things in motion that had already sort of been there. To people that are unfamiliar with this name and this assassination, it doesn't sound like that big of a deal. Who the hell was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand? Well, he was the son of the Austrian emperor, meaning Habsburg emperor. So this is still the Habsburg Empire. And he was the eldest son, so that meant when Daddy died, he was going to become the next Austro-Hungarian emperor. And his father was an octogenarian by the time the war broke out. So this guy was soon to be, if other things hadn't have intervened, most importantly his assassination, he was going to be the next emperor. So here you see the picture of the car that he was assassinated in, not really geared for defending against an assassination, I must say. His poor family on the right, his wife was in the car with him and was killed. The children were not. The coat is the coat he was actually wearing that day, besplattered with blood. The little insignia in the lower left is the motto, the insignia of a Serbian terrorist group known as the Black Hand. And that's the group that carried out the assassination. But boy, did they bungle the plot, and somehow succeeded anyway, almost by accident, in assassinating the Archduke. It was a comedy of errors, a team of assassins put together that were lined up in various places by their leader along a road in Sarajevo, as the Archduke made his trip through the city, which had been planned ahead of time. This was in the route that he was going to be traveling in the motorcade. he was in the middle car of, I don't know, 5, 6 cars, was published in the newspapers, also not exactly geared to preventing assassination. He had been warned through intelligence information that an assassination attempt was likely or possible. It was sort of there. They picked up something about it. Why did he go? Why to Sarajevo anyway? Sarajevo was a hotspot of anti-Austrian feeling, nationalist sentiment. Serbia already had its own independent country by this time. I skipped that part earlier in class. Carved out of the rapidly dissolving, though still alive, Ottoman Empire. But Serbs, at least many of them, were still unappeased and not happy with the situation, because in their mind, way too many Serbs still lived outside of the borders of Serbia, particularly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire under Austro-Hungarian rule. And we know nationalism is heightened sense of your identity, being tied to your nation, your people. It was fervent in Serbia, as it was in so many places in Europe. And in Serbia's case, it was mainly geared towards uniting all Serbian peoples, sort of in one, inside one border. And so there had been all kinds of upheaval in Serbian territory within the empire, and the Archduke was kind of there on a goodwill tour to show, to try to put a positive spin on Austro-Hungarian rule there, but also lay down some element, I think, of authority, but in a soft way. So the mission, I guess, was seen as so important, and by him included, that they went through with it, even with the known danger that may have awaited them. I mean, they knew there was potential danger, even if there hadn't been a rumored assassination attempt and plot. So the terrorists, unbeknownst to poor Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, were strewn out along the motorcade route. Again, it had been published. And the reason this was a comedy of errors, or the way it was a comedy of errors, is that as the cars kind of rolled through the first place where there were two terrorists across the street from each other, and they had armed with guns and hand grenades, bombs, I don't know, Molotov cocktails, whatever. And the motorcade went through, and neither of them did anything. Whether they froze, didn't think they had the right opportunity because there's too many people around them, is unclear, but they didn't do anything. The next person along the motorcade route actually threw a bomb, which hit the back of the Archduke's car and rolled off under the car behind him, exploded there, and wounded, I think, everyone in the car. At that point, the motorcade stopped and rerouted to the hospital to take care of those that were wounded in the attempted assassination. And then that left the other assassins further down the road wondering what happened. Did the assassination already happen? And that's why the motorcade stopped, so we're not needed any longer? Or what? So this became somewhat chaotic. And it looks like they've failed to kill the Archduke at this point. By the way, that guy that did launch a hand grenade or bomb, the crowd there, so apparently not everyone in Sarajevo hated the Archduke and the Habsburg family so much they're willing to see an assassin, get away. They chased him into the river. He went into the river and started beating him while he was trying to take a cyanide pill and commit suicide. And which he did. He failed to do it, but he did succeed in getting the crap beaten out of him by the crowd. So this really was bungled big time. So how did they assassinate him? Well, Franz Ferdinand went to City Hall and made a speech kind of ahead of schedule, since the motorcade was somewhat canceled. And after that, he then wanted to go to the hospital to see how those were doing who had been wounded. And so they're now on a different street, going in a different direction. because the original motorcade wasn't heading to the hospital. And one of the assassins, would-be assassins, at least at this point, Gavrilo Princip, 19-year-old kid, joins this terrorist organization. He got impatient because he didn't know what was going on and walked to a place to get something to eat for like lunch. And when he came out of the, just by chance, when he came out of the, the restaurant, at that very moment, the motorcade, which is now back in action but heading to the hospital, the lead driver, not Franz Ferdinand's car, but one of the head car, made a wrong turn into a dead-end street. And so the whole motorcade came to a stop. And it was only like, I think it was only 5 or 7 cars. I think it was 5. So it's not that big, and they're about that big. So it's not that big of a deal, but it's a little bit of a, going to take some time to get everybody back out, sort of, and get get them back kind of in sync, in the right position again. So there was at least a few moments where the Archduke's car came to a stop while they were, figuring this out and waiting for the ones behind them to back out. And at that exact moment when he came to a stop is the moment when Gavrilo Princip just by chance came out of the restaurant and happened to see, oh, there's the Archduke right in front of me in that wide open car, and he was at point blank range. It was like right on the sidewalk, and he just pulled the pistol out and went pop, 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 hit the Archduke and his wife in the neck. They both bled out within minutes, and that was that. So that's what you call a successful assassination of an Archduke. So that spark now was sort of thrown into this big fuel tank of all these sort of things that had built up over the long term, which help or do cause the explosion that comes next, the explosion known as the Great War. So Richard Evans, who I've quoted in previous lectures, said that well before August 1914, the outbreak of a general war was widely anticipated across Europe, hoped for by some, feared by others. So the idea of a major war was already kind of in the air. Excuse me, I'm drinking tea while lecturing. Forgive me. So there are 5 major, I think, long-term causes of this war. We could add some others and quibble with this a bit. Let's not. So, 1, nationalism and overlapping empires, or we could just say nationalism, imperialism, and they kind of go together. We could separate those out too, but let's not. 2, expansion southward as a major Russian goal. 3, European militarism and German saber rattling. We'll come back to what that means. 4, this is pretty well known, rival blocks of alliances. We'll see how that contributed and came about. And plans and timetables. I'm guessing the 5th one is probably not something most people are familiar with. All in due course. In this course, that was a joke. European nationalism and imperialism. So we'll tackle this first. By 1914, nationalism was a thing for sure in Europe. Remember that we traced the origins of nationalism in Europe basically back to the French Revolution. Some historians go back even much further than that. But it's fair enough, I believe, to say that modern nationalism was sort of put into motion by the French Revolution and the response and reaction to it and against it, as I think we know by now. But by this point, about 100 years after that, 100 years plus after that, nationalism is sort of seeped into the fabric of everyday life. Remember that much of nationalism is culturally constructed and top-down in orientation, meaning governments use as many methods as possible to instill a patriotic, nationalistic fervor in their people. And it had succeeded, certainly by 1914 and before that. So this sharpened national identities among minorities living in foreign nations, for instance, like the Serbs, some of whom were living under Austro-Hungarian rule. Nationalism right? If the Serbs become heavily nationalistic, and they have, given their situation, that's going to naturally lead to complaints about having to live under the thumb of this foreign German-speaking monarchy. So we'll see the same thing happening, or we see the same thing happening in other parts of the world, even outside of Europe. The movement for Indian independence. We talked about Gandhi briefly in our lecture on imperialism, and the Indian National Congress. That was inspired by nationalistic fervor as well. Not the only reason to explain that movement to try to drive the British out of India, but it's similar to what the Serbs and some other European groups who are minorities in larger societies of people that speak a different language, and they feel persecuted, and or they want independence to make a go of things themselves. The other way that nationalism has an impact here is that it was just so deeply entrenched by this time that Europeans were prone to supporting their government, almost like we support baseball and football teams today or whatever. There was definitely a jingoism, a patriotism in the air. So much so that when the war broke out in 1914, and our textbook does at least briefly mention this, there was a celebratory mood in the capitals of Europe, London, Paris, Berlin, and so forth, where these huge crowds came out, and it was like everybody had a big tailgate party. Woohoo! We're going to war. It's gonna be exciting stuff, and so that's a good marker, I think, of how thoroughly, how deeply nationalism has sort of penetrated the European consciousness in one type of nationalism, or one ethnic cultural brand of nationalism after another: French, Russian, Italian, and so on and so forth. Professor Gilbert, Felix Gilbert, in a book called The End of the European Era, 1890 to the Present, says the rise of nationalism throughout the 19th century implied the political participation of the wider population. It soon became obvious that the pressure which an aroused public opinion might exert could be used for special purposes and interests. Newspapers and pamphlets drew attention to the causes they favored. The preferred field of pressure by public opinion was foreign affairs. The most popular cry was for overseas expansion. In almost all countries, organizations for colonial propaganda were supported by economic interests. Every great European state wanted to become a world power, not a world POW. So this is where we can see there's an overlap between nationalism and imperialism. The nationalistic fervor was often directed, one, towards foreign affairs, which could mean a war within Europe, like a great war, hint, hint, but it could also mean sort of supporting your country in overseas conflicts further afield in your country's empire. And we should note, and in a sense remember, that there's so many European colonies around the world that a lot of them sort of butt up against each other. They're bordered on other colonies. So the points of conflict between, say, France and Germany weren't just on the border between France and Germany. It's anywhere in the world where France and Germany are neighbors with their colonies. So it just meant more points of contact, more possible flashpoints for a war to break out. But certainly nationalism in both senses of the word that we talked about here figure heavily as long-term explanations for the war. Another way to say this from the other side would be, if not for nationalism, at least if not for heavy nationalism that had really done its job by this time, one could imagine tepid to weak support for a war effort in country after country, which may have changed the game and forced governments to take a less warlike hand in all of this. So they would have maybe likely or certainly been less able to carry out a warlike and more oriented foreign policy. The powder keg of Europe. this is the Balkans, almost said Baltic, but the Balkans region, which is Southeast Europe, which the Serbs, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Bosnia, all these areas. So, and this was known by European leaders as the powder keg of Europe already before the war. So they were already aware that this is a potential flashpoint as well, and it showed itself not just in 1914, but in the years sort of leading up to it as well. The Austrian Habsburg Empire in 1908 annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. All of the area that you see in the blue stripes there, they just took, right? And it borders the already existing independent country of Serbia. But if we know that the Serbians were already none too pleased that there were, so many Serbs living outside their borders under the, leadership of foreign countries from their vantage point, this is going to infuriate them, and indeed did. And one could certainly say, plenty have, that Austria wasn't thinking clearly by doing this, because not only did it sort of inflame radical, violent Serbian opposition and nationalism to the point of more and more terrorist groups being formed, etc., but it also brought them into conflict with a number of the European countries. This whole Balkans crisis is sometimes called, in the years leading up to World War I, caused friction, for instance, between Austria-Hungary and a former ally, Russia. They had basically ceased to be allies by this time anyway, but this made things worse between them. In a great book mainly on World Wars I and II, in the same book, a theme uniting them together, the great historian named Neil Ferguson, a Brit who is an American historian. He's at Harvard, I believe now. The War of the Worlds. The War of the World. It's a take on the War of the Worlds, but he says in this book that one of the explanations for how and why war came about were overlapping empires in the Balkans, quote, as geopolitical fault lines. In the years before 1914, the geopolitical tectonic plates, known as empires, were shifting underneath Sarajevo. Not literally, of course. Turkey's was giving way. Austria's was pushing forward. So too was Russia's. Russian pan-Slavists, meaning Russians who saw themselves as, in kinship with fellow Slavs in the Balkans, were appalled by the Austrian annexation of Bosnia. So, as I said, this didn't do anything for Austrian-Russian relations. It brought the other European countries in, at least with concern about what's happening here. But most importantly, it did inflame, Serbian nationalist thinking. Another cause of the war, this one has really only been put forward fairly recently in a book that I'll talk about, but Russia had sort of major reasons to, at this time in particular, to support a war for its own reasons. It had been true for a long time, for centuries, that Russia had a perceived need to have another place in the world where they had access to the ocean. And the Black Sea actually offered that, where Crimea is, and Ukraine to the north of the Black Sea, Crimean Peninsula. But in order to get their ships, and they had ships in the Black Sea, but to get them into the Mediterranean and out into the larger world, if necessary, they had to go through the passage, the straits where Istanbul or Constantinople is, which you can see on the map there, because there's an arrow pointing to it, red arrow, and then through what are called the Dardanelles Strait after that. And for basically the entire time we've been talking about in this class, since the British Navy became supreme, Great Britain saw it as in its strategic interest to make sure that the Russian fleet, the Russians themselves, did not have access to the Mediterranean from the Black Sea. So they basically kept the Russians bottled up. And this was part of a long-term conflict between Great Britain and Russia that we haven't really talked about in this class, in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, all the way to Afghanistan, which is sometimes called the Great Game, the sort of back and forth chess game between the Russians and the Brits. So by this time, 1914, when the war breaks out, Russia is chafing at the bit to get out of the Black Sea. So they have reason to want to go to war, any war basically, that would give them an excuse to take Constantinople and the Dardanelles, put under their control, and start sending their ships through. I think quintessential book on this is fairly recent, maybe 10 years old or less at this point. Sean McMeekin, a fairly young historian, a great one, wrote a book called The Russian Origins of the First World War. I've read his more recent books on July 1914 about this very crisis. He wrote I think his last book was on the Russian Revolution, which was also excellent. He's a great historian and a very good writer. His books are very interesting. But anyway, this is the first one of his that I read. And he says, Russia in 1914 was a country with much to lose, but for which the risks of inaction seemed to be at least as great and possibly greater than those of action. It was a country whose leaders would not shrink from going to war to improve her precarious position in a hostile international environment. So Russian leaders, we know from the records, were very concerned about getting access to that part of the world, that area that they'd been denied for so long, and there was sort of a greater intensity of the perceived need here. So Russia's long-term strategic interests lie, not just but in Constantinople and the Dardanelles. They knew this, they had for a long time, and they appear to have wanted to have a war as an excuse to move aggressively in and on these places. Which brings us back to Otto von Bismarck. When Bismarck came to power in the 1860s, we know he worked for Wilhelm I, King of Prussia, who later went on to be crowned first Emperor of United Germany. And Bismarck, not surprisingly, stayed on as Chancellor of the new United Germany. He was Chancellor of Prussia. Remember that when we looked at the unification of Germany, in some ways it's correct to think of it as the enlargement of Prussia at first. So Bismarck was the Chancellor of Prussia. Now he's the Chancellor of the much bigger Germany. So in a sense, he got a promotion as his similar promotion to the one his boss, the king, then emperor, got. Well, Wilhelm passed away at the end of the 1880s, and for a short time was succeeded by his son. And had fate turned out differently, which conceivably, it could have, the Bismarck's boss's grandson, the guy you see here, Kaiser Wilhelm II, may have never become emperor. But as luck, or bad luck would have it, because Kaiser Wilhelm caused so many problems, his father, who held the throne for a number of months, when his father had passed away, Bismarck's old boss, the new Kaiser, the new emperor, was already in the late stages of throat cancer, and so only lasted on the throne for several months. He died, and the next in line, next heir, was another young Hohenzollern, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Interestingly, his father was a German liberal, basically the doctrines of liberalism we've already gone through on a number of occasions, and was married to the daughter of Queen Victoria of England. And England, of course, being the most well-known and liberal country in the world at the time. And So this is a great what-if question, counterfactual history. What if the father would have lived? What if he didn't get cancer, and maybe this guy would have never become emperor, or at least much later? The father wasn't that old when this happened, because father and son were very different, at least politically. Father was a liberal, and Kaiser Wilhelm II was a staunch conservative here. Well, one of the problems was that Kaiser Wilhelm was certainly not lacking in intelligence, but he was lacking in emotional stability and maturity. And he was a rather mercurial, odd sort. He had a lot of imperfections, to put it mildly. He was very prickly. He was very insecure. Had a bad temper. Was unpredictable, and so this is not the right quality in a leader of one of the major countries in the world. Qualities, and he had a huge ego to go along with him, and of course so did Otto von Bismarck. And the Kaiser inherited Bismarck, and so he was his chancellor at first. But it didn't take long for the two gigantic egos to clash, and everyone, I'm sure, could see this coming. After not that long, Wilhelm dismissed Bismarck, and Bismarck went into retirement. He had some designs on coming back at some point, thinking he may be asked back, but it wasn't to be. So Bismarck lived for another better part of a decade in retirement. And Kaiser Wilhelm was not Bismarck in terms of ability, and that's to be sure. And just taking two pithy quotes from Professor Rourke, our lovable professor, textbook author, said foreign policy under Bismarck was done with restraint to preserve order and stability in Europe. And moving over to the right, in the same section in our book, it talks about the Kaiser as lacking Bismarck's diplomatic skills and cool restraint. And that's putting it mildly. Bismarck, we know, was a master diplomat, and he had put together, not completely by himself, but it was largely his doing, because there was a perceived need for Germany to do so, to preserve order, stability, peace in Europe. It's a quite complicated piece of machinery through treaties and alliances and secret negotiations that Bismarck had in place to keep any major German or European war from happening. The reason being that with the Germany, after it united in 1871, Bismarck was correctly concerned that if we start acting aggressively outside of our boundaries, people are already freaked out that we unified in the first place, and out of nowhere became the biggest country with the biggest economy in Europe, west of Russia. But if we start acting aggressively, they're going to be doubly afraid and fearful, and it might cause them to do what European powers are prone to doing when they fear one of them is about to or already has broken out of the balance of power. They balance against you and ally against you and fight you. So Bismarck was, again, I think rightly fearful that if our foreign policy is too aggressive, even perceived to be aggressive, even if it's not meant that way, we might have to be fighting with all of Europe, and at a time when we're trying to consolidate the unification of Germany, no easy task, it's probably not good timing. It could cause this whole process of unification that's been long coming to collapse. So it wasn't because Bismarck was a peacenik. We know he wasn't. He used warfare 3 times to unite Germany, but after the unification, the math, the German interests changed, and so he adapted accordingly. But the Kaiser that followed him was younger, in his 40s, not as experienced, and again, not having the skills, the ability, the sort of the emotional temperament to really handle the kind of pressure that he was under as a major leader on the world stage. So with Bismarck gone, that very delicately constructed peace-preserving European foreign policy, largely put together by Bismarck, went by the wayside. The first thing that happened, which was, I think, critical, was that the linchpin of Bismarck's careful diplomacy over the years was something called the Reinsurance Treaty between Germany and Russia. And this was delicate, this part of it, because remember, Austria and Russia, who had once been friends, are now enemies. And yet Germany needs to keep an alliance with both of them. So how do you stay on good terms with two countries who hate each other? You've probably been in that situation, I know I have, before, personally, where you're friends with two different people who hate each other or end up hating each other, and it puts you in an awkward spot. So this is what happens here in Germany. So Bismarck plays this quite deftly by signing a formal treaty of alliance with Austria and then a secret reinsurance treaty with Russia. And the key was to keep it secret from Austria if possible, which one could argue certainly is duplicitous on Bismarck and Germany's part, but it did, I think, help to maintain peaceful relations European-wide. That connected to all of his other negotiations and treaties. So, but that was sort of the piece that if you pulled it out, the whole thing was going to come crumbling down. And what happens? Within months of Bismarck being dismissed, the Kaiser and his advisors, who sort of did foreign policy together, let the reinsurance treaty with Russia lapse. Gone. Just like that. What Bismarck saw as the key piece in German foreign policy, within months they just let it go entirely. And the consequences of this were predictable. I'm sure Bismarck had predicted it. I forget if he had, but I'm sure he had. And that is, well, if Germany's not going to be there for an alliance, to be Russia's ally, then Russia's going to feel like we need a new ally, and a powerful one. And there aren't that many options. We know there are 5 major powers of Europe. And the alliance in 1894 between Russia and France was the result that Bismarck had foreseen for sure, predicted if we let, again, the treaty with Russia go, because this is bad for Germany in the long run, since on a map you can see clearly that it would put Germany in between, two allied countries, France to the west and Russia to the east. And this, of course, has complete relevance to World War I, because Germany has to fight, by that time, a two-front war. Had France and Russia not allied, because Germany kept the reinsurance treaty with Russia alive, and Russia wouldn't have been in need of a major ally, that might have changed everything as well. But it wasn't to be. One of the reasons I think the Kaiser and his advisors believed that a French-Russian alliance isn't going to happen is because France and Russia had very different political systems by that time. France was already moving towards democracy, and Russia was still pretty much it was technically a constitutional monarchy by this time, or around this time, but it was still really an absolute monarchy. So it was thought that because they're ideologically opposed, or ideologically far away from each other, they're not going to get together. But I think that's always a mistake to think that when larger interests, strategic interests are at stake, an existential crisis at hand, people will throw out ideology and pick strange allies because they're desperate. So I think it was all around poor thinking on the part of Kaiser Wilhelm and his staff, and it certainly makes Bismarck look good, but that's not just a look. It's because Bismarck had constructed, I think, a brilliant system, but that's gone now. And sure enough, on the other side of that, comes increasingly boneheaded, unnecessarily aggressive foreign policy and statements coming from Germany that did nothing but scare the other countries. Exactly what Bismarck had been trying to prevent and had been doing successfully all those years. We don't want to, get the other countries riled up and then turn against us when we're trying to consolidate this, unification into a united, centralized Germany. Professor Evans again says, from 1905 onwards, the British government regarded Germany, not Russia or France, as the main threat to British interests. This view had already been adopted by British Foreign Office officials, notably Sir Ira Crowe, who wrote that either Germany was consciously aiming at the establishment of a German hegemony, which means dominance, at first in Europe and eventually in the world, or that the great German design is in reality no more than the expression of a vague, confused, and impractical statesmanship not realizing its own drift. Either way, he concluded, the result was the same. Germany had to be opposed. Not everyone high in British political circles felt that way. Ira Crowe was the loudest, though he wasn't he was kind of an underling at the Foreign Office. I mean, not a real underling, but he wasn't the head guy, so he had limited ability to, get what he thought was the right policy in place. Evans goes on to say, after 1890, before that, a younger generation of German politicians, just after Bismarck was fired, and statesmen came to power, imbued with a self-confidence in Germany's destiny and a disdain for the elaborate system of diplomatic alignment that Bismarck had erected to shield the young empire from its enemies. New German leaders pursued a belligerent and imperialistic foreign policy that frightened other states, especially Britain. So some of it was in the form of statements that were made. Germany must have its place in the sun. The Germans started talking about a world policy. What do you mean world policy? You're trying to take over the world? And there was some fear that that might be what they were doing. I don't think it was, though their policy certainly was aggressive and meant to be. But this is what happens when you have someone in power that's reckless and sort of is not stable and is getting too carried away with themselves, not showing patience and prudence and restraint, as Bismarck did, and just start sort of throwing out words, when you need to be more delicate. So Germany starts to frighten Britain, France, and everybody else with its statements as well as its actions. Another set of events that show German saber rattling were the two Moroccan crises. So crisis in Morocco in 1905 and one in 1911. We don't really need to get into the nuts and bolts of either of those. They were somewhat similar, but in both cases, certain amounts of types of instability came about in Morocco, and all the European countries had economic interests primarily in Morocco. So they all had a vested interest in seeing Morocco's problems solved, not because they cared about Morocco, but because they wanted to protect their investments. And Germany got involved in these crises. Right, this is after Bismarck's gone, well after, and so now this is Kaiser Wilhelm's foreign policy at work, and the guys he sent to negotiate with Morocco and the other European countries acted in a belligerent, aggressive fashion. So much so that in the second Moroccan crisis, and this came from the government itself, the Kaiser must have signed off on this. They sent a gunboat known as the Panther. I don't think it was a battleship, but it was a gunboat, a military, a naval vessel that had, guns on it. And it was sitting in the harbor. It didn't fire at anybody, but it didn't need to. All the other European countries got the message. Germany is not just negotiating in good faith. They're negotiating by twisting our arms, in a sense, saying, either make a decision here that's favorable to us the way we want it, or things could get kind of nasty. Kind of like the German negotiators are sitting at the table, sort of using their fist to hit their hand. I said, okay, you're gonna do the right thing here. So this caused fear, anxiety, and just sort of a feeling of this is strange. What are the Germans doing? Germany had calculated, I have no idea how they could have done this, but they thought that, at least in the second Moroccan crisis, when they sent the gunboat, that the negotiations would be a way to separate France from Britain. France and Britain were drawn by 1905, 1911. They were drawing closer together. They weren't in a formal alliance at that point, at least not one that was totally binding, but they were moving more in that direction. And Germany had its own interest in seeing that, not succeed, and they thought that by acting aggressively at Morocco, it would drive France and Britain further apart. It had the opposite effect, which I think was predictable. It brought France and Britain closer together. So what is saber rattling? Well, it's a metaphor for aggressive foreign policy. Foreign policy that does frighten your neighbors, frighten other countries. A saber, of course, is a sword. If you're rattling the saber in front of somebody, not hitting them or slashing them with it, right? You're engaging in intimidating behavior, threatening behavior, but you're not actually using the saber, at least yet. But if you're rattling a saber in front of somebody, even if you're not hitting them, they're bound, of course, to either be afraid or at the very least wonder, why are they doing this? Right? Are they going to eventually, hit me or someone else with the saber? So saber rattling is just a fancy way to say that German aggressive foreign policy was just irresponsible and was intimidating and frightening unnecessarily in ways that weren't even good for its own interests. Bismarck would have surely seen that, did see it, but these guys now in control did not. The major example, the most important example of saber rattling in an irresponsible way is the famous Anglo-German naval rivalry. Germany didn't have much of a navy before Kaiser Wilhelm got to power, and then he got it into his head that Germany must have a strong navy. He worked with a guy named Admiral von TIRPITZ, who was the leading naval officer who supported the idea of a much larger German navy. And he was kind of the Kaiser's point man in Berlin, going to the Reichstag, the German parliament, elected officials, and sort of trying to push this through. So he's kind of his PR guy as well as a naval admiral. So what's the big deal about Germany trying to build a bigger, more powerful navy? Remember that we talked about when Germany first unified, one of the ways the European powers sort of got together, or at least found a way to fit this into a balance of power structure, way of thinking, was their agreement. This is, of course, an unwritten, just a tacit agreement, that Germany would be allowed to have the largest land army because it was the most populous country anyway once it unified. But Great Britain, everybody would sort of just agree that Great Britain wouldn't be challenged on the seas. And then those two major powers, one primarily land power, the other primarily a sea power, would be able to check each other. So you can see what's coming here. Different countries, most European countries, felt relatively safe as long as both sides were adhering to that bargain. But when the Kaiser comes around and starts building aggressively a navy, which in a sense was challenging the supremacy of the British Navy, then in yet another, in this case even more aggressive and frightening way, Germany is sort of stepping outside of its bounds. And the thinking was, what are they trying to do? Take over the world? We've already agreed that this newcomer country can have the largest army, land army. We don't really like the idea, but we're willing to make that concession. But the concession they had to make, and did, was that Britain would have the unchallenged naval supremacy in Europe. And now they're challenging it. So this, of course, caused the most tension and opposition in Great Britain, but this was met everywhere with anxiousness and fear. So it's an indication, as Perry says, that German leaders had abandoned Bismarck's policy of good sense. That's for sure. That is putting it mildly. So what did they hope to achieve from this? Because there was no way that they were going to catch the British Navy. There was no way. Von Tirpitz put together a theory. This became known as the risk theory. And this is part of the way he sold this to the German politicians. The risk theory was that we don't have to equal Britain's, fleet size. We just need to get to about 2/3. If we can get our battleships and cruisers and destroyers to about 2/3 the number that the British have, we'll be in good shape. Why? Because we'll be big enough then, not necessarily to defeat the British fleet, but we'll be big enough to maul it seriously in any kind of major war. And since the fleet, the Navy, is Britain's pride and joy, they're going to be reluctant to take that fleet out of the garage in a war with a country that has at least a fleet 2/3 their size, because it might get their Navy dented up. So they're not going to take it out of the garage. That was the risk theory, which basically sold in Germany, incredibly, since it's boneheaded to think that actually makes any sense. But that was the theory, and it's partly how this got done. And so sure enough, they started building battleships, most famously, but other ships at a furious pace, started to challenge the British. And this sometimes is referred to as sort of the dreadnought rivalry. The largest and most advanced, high-tech, effective battleships were the dreadnought class battleships, and both sides now start building those and more. Then they eventually get to like super dreadnoughts, so it's an arms race, a naval arms buildup between the two. Kind of like how in the more recent past, nuclear arms races have happened. Both sides furious trying to keep up with the other. The British actually tried to, at one point or more, negotiate with the Germans and say, look, this doesn't make any sense. And they were more or less right. First of all, the Germans couldn't really hide that they were building ships and how many and what types from Britain, because they're right across the English Channel and the North Sea from them. So they couldn't really hide it. And so Britain, its negotiators, its diplomats just said, you're never going to catch us, because once we see you're building 5 new battleships, we'll build 5 or 6 more. We still have more money than you do. So you'll build a bigger navy, and so will we, and we'll just sort of maintain the level of distance as we both sort of rise at about the same rate, if we don't rise even higher. So why don't we just, both of us, save our resources and money and time and just agree not to do this, because you're not going to catch us anyway. But that didn't move the relatively new German leadership under the Kaiser. Another part of the fuel leading to the outbreak of war in August of 1914 were the rival blocks of alliances. By August of 1914, Europe was basically split into 2 hostile camps of alliances. A dangerous situation. A bipolar system in Europe was dangerous. One of the first places you can see this in European history takes us way back to ancient Greece, but there was a similar arrangement in ancient Greece between Athens and Sparta. And Athens put together an alliance of city-states, fellow Greeks, under their protective wing. And when Sparta wasn't involved, Sparta then put together a group of city-states as a alliance system with them as the leader. And so what happened then is basically what happens here in 1914 in Europe. Athens and Sparta, when they eventually went to war with each other, as they did in the famous Peloponnesian War, it sucked all the other city-states in Greece in as well due to their treaty and alliance obligations. And so it took what could have been just a local war between Athens and Sparta they were already the two biggest city-states in the Greek world, so it still would have been a pretty big war, but not nearly as big because it would have excluded all or most of the other Greek city-states. So it forced all the other ones in because they had this sort of elaborate two sides, two different alliances. If there had been even 3 or 4 different alliances, that's probably safer than if sort of everybody's sort of in line with in one side or the other. There were some, as there was in Europe, people that stayed neutral and didn't go on either side. But there are some pressures to be involved one way or the other. So by the time 1914 and the war comes around, of the 5 major powers, things look thus. You can see this on the map. On one side, in this, these 2 blocks of alliances, you have the Allied powers, Russia, France, Great Britain, and Italy, though Italy is of lesser importance here. And on the other side, you have German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and the Turkish Empire. And within those, of course, we have our 5 major powers. So if we take Turkey off the map there and Italy off the map, then we're back to our 5 major powers. Bismarck, when he was still in power, had said at one point, I forget when and what he was, what the occasion was, but he said the math on a general European war is simple. Whichever group in the 5 major powers has 3 against the 2 will win. 3 defeats 2. And this did play out somewhat this way, as we'll see. Professor Perry says about this, perhaps the war, and he says this nice and concisely, I don't think I'll need to say any more, perhaps the war might have been avoided, or at least limited to Austria and Serbia, if Europe in 1914 had not been split into 2 hostile alliance systems. Such a situation contains inherent dangers. Counting on the support of its allies, a country might pursue a more provocative and reckless course and be less conciliatory during a crisis. Furthermore, a conflict between 2 states might spark a chain reaction that draws in the other powers, transforming a limited war into a general war, which of course is what exactly happened here. Why countries live up to treaty obligations so consistently, there are cases where they break them, is, I think, sometimes puzzling to students, but it's fairly obvious. You live up to your treaties because no one will trust you if you don't. So when you desperately need allies and can't find any, that will be why. Because when we needed you said you were going to be have our backs, and you didn't. So why should we come to you and assist you in your time of need? So it's sort of a mutual give and take here. An example of what we call reciprocal altruism in a sense. So in the end, everybody did follow, go with their alliances. The one country that was sort of a wild card, the last one to really decide, and no one was surprised, were the British. By the time the war broke out, they already had alliances with France and Russia, but they were still making noises like they might not get in the war. Even though to France and Russia, it seemed like, wait a minute, you already signed this. But I always think of the British during this period as lawyers, and many of them were lawyers. Many of the members of the House of Commons were lawyers, or former lawyers. As politicians in the United States, many are today. But if you think of them as lawyers, the British were always really good at finding loopholes in agreements. And so it's sort of like they're saying, well, not so fast, Russia and France. Right here in page 12, section 4, paragraph 3, it says clearly that we're only obligated to come to your assistance if, blah, 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 and find a way to sort of say, I'm not so sure this is legally binding on us. And this wouldn't be the first time or last time that Britain went against its word, again, forcing it to take risks that they might not have allies in the future. In the end, in a very close and tense situation, the British cabinet did vote to go to war alongside of France and Russia, but there were a number of resignations from the cabinet in anger over it, and it was close. They were split kind of down the middle and barely got the majority to vote. Winston Churchill, still a fairly young, up-and-coming a member of the cabinet, voted in favor of war, as did the Prime Minister H.H. Asquith in the end. But many of the other famous ones, Lloyd George became a Prime Minister at the end of the war. He voted against it, at least for a time. So this was tense and right up to the last minute. We'll see that this lack of clarity on the part of Britain, in what policy it's going to, what stance it's going to take on this war, contributed to the problem. Another factor, this is the one I said you probably don't know too much about, it's actually the most interesting in some ways, are plans, timetables, and the Schlieffen Plan as the most famous of the plans. But warfare was such by this time, advanced and well organized, that countries had plans, contingency plans ahead of time. I mean ahead of time even before they knew there was going to be a war with country X. They'd already have a contingency plan drawn up for a potential war with country X, which is, by the way, how it's done completely today. Trust me, the U.S. has contingency plans already worked out for fighting, possibly country X or Y or Z. We don't have one for Canada. I mean, the ones that make sense. And it doesn't mean that you're going to stick to the plan, because it may have been, last updated 3 years before or 5 years before, or the situation is different than you had thought it was going to be. But you have at least something already done, something already organized, at least as a starting point, right? The point of departure for thinking about it even more clearly. However, in Europe in 1914, they weren't adjusting their plans. They were pretty much stuck and felt like they were married to their plans, which ends up being a problem. Not only plans, but timetables as integral to the plans. So it was believed that you have to have a plan, stick to it, and you have to sort of set a time limit and table. So if we're attacking, country X, we've decided ahead of time we need to be here, 25 miles into the country by week 1. We need to be 30 miles into the country by week 2. We need to have captured their capital by week 4 at the latest. So they put themselves on these sort of strict timetables. So plans and timetables. The most famous one was the Schlieffen Plan. The Russians had, I think, Plan 19. The French one was called Plan 17. They weren't as creatively named, but everybody had a plan. And the belief was, ironically, because it ended up being totally wrong, was that with the weapons that they had at their disposal now, industrialized sort of weapons, mass-produced weapons, artillery, machine guns, that offense was going to win wars. Offense would win, not defense. So the plans, all of them, at least of the major powers, all envisioned and planned for getting the jump on the other side, attacking them before they attack you. Because if your plan is offensive in nature, I don't mean offensive like it's insulting, they're that too, but offense-oriented, then you can't afford to have the other country invade your territory first, because then you're thrown on the defensive, and it also throws off your timetable. So we got to attack them before they attack us. And we'll come back to this, because it does, that type of thinking could lead to a war or make one more likely, in and of itself. Felix Gilbert, again, talking about this, says the distinction between mobilization and war became increasingly difficult in the industrial age. Whereas in the pre-industrial age, a country could mobilize its troops, march them to the frontier, and stop them there, now mobilization and war were almost identical. For the mobilization and the deployment of mass armies, a timetable had to be established well in advance, and once the military plans had been worked out, last-minute modifications could not be made without leading to chaos. So, in a sense, they had no choice to do this, but it's dangerous nonetheless. So what was the Schlieffen Plan? The Schlieffen Plan was Germany's plan ahead of time. Was finished, as I think, in 1905, so almost 10 years before World War I broke out. But by 1905, they already knew enough to know that the main feature, at least of a general European war, if it came, would be that Germany would have to fight a war on two fronts because of the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, which came about because of the Germans allowing the reinsurance treaty between themselves and Russia lapse. So we get back to that again. Count Alfred von Schlieffen, head of the German general staff, sort of head of the army, was the guy who devised the plan. And in many ways, a gifted military intellectual. So this is basically his plan. He had other leaders working on it, but it's mainly his authorship here. And the problem he's faced with, of course, is how to fight a two-front war. And his solution, which was brilliant in a sense, was don't fight a two-front war. So how do you fight and win a two-front war? By not fighting a two-front war. So I mean you're just backing down? No. What it meant was put 7/8 or a large, preponderance of your military into attacking one of the two sides, in this case either France or Russia, and knock them out of the war quickly according to your timetable that you've put together in a way that's, okay, we got to do this quickly. And then as soon as that country is taken out, occupied, their capital goes down, then you ferry those troops by train, the fastest other way to get there, back to the other front, hopefully just as the enemy forces there are just getting to the front lines, and so you're basically fighting them one at a time. After knocking out the first one quickly, then you can, get the troops. If you get the troops back to the other side, your other front quickly, then you can sort of take more time in fighting the second enemy. And the Schlieffen plan did pick France to attack first, and not Russia. And that wasn't just like a flip of a coin. Schlieffen was certainly right about this part of the plan. Why did France have to come first? They're a more industrialized country. They're closer to Germany. They share a border with Germany. They have modern transportation systems, trains and so forth, in a way that Russia doesn't, or not nearly as extravagant. France is much smaller than Russia, so their transportation systems are, in a sense, can get people from point A to point B more quickly. They have more trains, more rail lines, better ones, right? And they don't have to travel as much distance. So if you attack Russia first, the French armies will sort of be in your backyard before you know it, because they're right there already, just across the border, and they have tremendous transportation systems and not that far to travel. Whereby the Russians have far less modernization and high-tech, accoutrement, especially railroads, and they have much further different distances to travel. So you have to attack France first, hope you can knock them out quickly, and get your troops back to the Russian front, just as sort of the slow, lumbering, low-tech Russians get their huge army to the front lines, and you're already there kind of waiting for them. So this was, if you're going to do this, try to fight a two-front war by fighting one at a time, it was imperative that you attack France first and Russia second, and not the other way around. So there was a lot of chessboard thinking that went into this. It was a very rational plan in lots of ways. Schlieffen was of Prussian background. This has the hallmarks of Prussian organization and military preciseness all over it in most ways. But it had flaws, for sure. One of which was that Schlieffen believed that to get to Paris the most quickly, the best way to do that was to not just put 7/8 of the German army attacking France and having just 1/8 hold the line against Russia at the beginning, but most of those troops attacking from Germany into France were to be put on the right wing, meaning that it wouldn't be an equally balanced line and movement. There'd be far more troops, a far larger volume of attack coming from the right side of the line than the other. So it was, and you could sort of then swing, as you could see in the map, then you could kind of swing down, kind of like a hinge of a door, and swing down into France that way. If you have most of your weight, say from our perspective here, the map looking at it the way it is, west to the left, right, the right side from the German perspective is that arrow that's to our left here. So you put most of the troops in that arrow and fewer on the other arrows. But that is problematic for one particular reason, and that is what you see on the screen. Belgium was a neutral country and remained neutral, and there was great reason to believe that if Belgian neutrality was violated, that Britain would get into the war for sure. Even if it wouldn't and didn't get into the war for other reasons, it would for sure there. That was the belief. It's still unclear whether that's true or not, but it very well may have been. Why were the British so keen to defend Belgian neutrality? It's very simple, and that is that if you look at the map, you can't really see it here, but Belgium is right across the English Channel from Great Britain. So they weren't doing it because they loved Belgium. They were doing it because to protect their own strategic interests. We can't let a country that's that close to us, even if there's a small body of water in between, right, be taken by a foreign power. Can't happen. So it's useful to speculate, although we can never know, that if Schlieffen's plan had avoided Belgium, done it somewhat differently, is it possible that Britain would have stayed out of the war? And I think the answer is a possible yes. The cabinet certainly did factor that in when they finally made the decision to go to war, that the Germans looked like they were about to and then did violate Belgian neutrality. The other problem with Schlieffen's plan was a more basic one, and that is as he started to crunch the numbers and look at the rail systems and roads in France on the way to Paris, he realized the number of troops that we need to get into France as quickly as we need them to get there to make this thing work quickly so we can get the troops back to fighting Russia afterwards. The problem is we don't have enough, even France, which is high-tech and has good transportation system, they still don't have enough to accommodate us. They don't have enough roads and railways and transportation period to transport the millions of troops we're going to have to send in there. And it didn't. He must have recalculated and come up with the same numbers. So he did what any, as I say, rational person would do, ultra-rational Prussian would do, which is he just ignored it and went on. I'm not kidding. That's what he did. So this plan is typically German, because the Germans, I haven't said this before, but you've probably picked up on it already, the Germans have this somewhat strange, the way of thinking that sort of pits the rational and the romantic together, kind of glues them together. They're not, they're kind of misfits together, but in Germany, it's sort of part rational, which mainly comes from the Prussian, background, military culture there. But we know the center of romanticism was in Germany, the dreamers as well. So Schlieffen, what I'm saying here, shows his sort of partly in this plan, his rational side, and also his German romantic side by just wishing the problem away. Oh, the numbers don't work out? Well, we'll just move on to something else and hopefully, cross our fingers, God willing, it'll work out anyway. So could all this have been stopped? That's still debated today by historians, but it's possible. And plenty of leaders wanted it to be stopped. The Kaiser and his Chancellor, Bateman Hollweg, wanted at the last minute even to get Germany out of this. Kaiser Wilhelm, showing his mercurial tendencies, is one of the culprits high on the list of guys that sort of got them into this position in the first place. Meaning he was basically pro-war, or at least totally okay with the war when the events started to unfold, and at the last minute he's now getting cold feet and trying to find a way to stop this. The phrase that was in circulation is, can we halt this in Belgrade, which is the capital of Serbia. So can we stop this from getting sort of beyond the conflict between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, and just keep it a localized war? So they were trying to basically keep the alliance systems from kicking in, and just make this a conflict between the two principal countries. And by the way, it wasn't entirely clear at first when the assassination happened that the Serbian terrorists that did it were put up to it by the Serbian government. The Austrians did an investigation pretty quickly and concluded that they did. Even now, it's not entirely clear how much the Serbian government was behind the assassination, but it appears that the Austrians had been right, to some degree. They at least were aware and were okay with it going through, if not even more. So the localized war was a possibility, at least theoretically. The Austro-Hungarian government had issued a ultimatum to Serbia, giving them 48 hours to comply with 10 points, 10 demands, or they were going to start a war. So with the 48 ultimatum, our ultimatum expiring, with Serbia only assenting to 9 of the 10 demands, the war was going to happen. Austria-Hungary basically issued that ultimatum to be rejected, so they'd have an excuse. Hey, look, we tried to make this peaceful, and we gave them terms that would allow this to be handled without violence, but they didn't accept the terms. Well, they accepted 9 out of the 10. Yeah, but we needed all 10. That was the deal. That was the agreement. So this was basically done to make it look like they were going the last mile for peace. Nonetheless, now it's really looks like there's going to be a war, since the Serbians didn't accept the ultimatum in full, and Austria is not willing to back down on it. But the Kaiser and other leaders are now getting jumpy about the whole thing. At one point late in the game, just before the declarations of war started to hit, Kaiser Wilhelm called his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. They were cousins, and said, are we really going to have to do this? Is there a way out? And there really wasn't at this point a way out. So the question I have in bold print there is, not only could all this have been stopped, but did the conflict reach a point where leaders became powerless to stop it? One of the most famous iterations of that question comes in a classic book, which you see there, The Guns of August, by a very talented, now deceased historian, Barbara Tuchman. Barbara Tuchman was a non-academic historian, meaning she wasn't a professor of history, but she wrote really good history, partly good in the sense that it was very readable. There were always, real history that she's writing about, but she wrote in such a fluid fashion. She had a knack for making it, feel like fiction. The Guns of August is like that. That's her most famous book. She wrote a lot of others as well. But she dealt with that issue about a conflict that could come about even when nobody wants it to come about, at least at a certain point. And this gets us back to, I think this is the main mechanism that makes the answer to this question, at least possibly, maybe. Remember that the plans and timetables, all of them, required, because the people that designed the plans and timetables believed it was necessary, that offense won. And so we can't allow them to attack us first, because it'll it'll ruin our plan or mess it up and get us off of our timetables immediately. Our timetable said we have to be inside their country within 20 miles within 5 days. But if they attack us first and drive us back into our own country, we're never going to meet that timetable. So there was a tendency then towards what we call preemption, which means we're going to attack them before they attack us. And mobilization, remember also, which mobilization I didn't define before, it's when your military goes from its sort of normal daily routines of training, and they're in their barracks, and to getting all their gear and weapons locked and loaded, and they're now out sort of ready to, they're outside of their barracks. Maybe they've traveled to the front, to the borders of your country, and they're in full ready mode. They're just waiting for the word, go, and a war starts. That's what mobilization means. But remember, mobilization by this time, because it was so hard to stop in a modern industrial society, big armies now, that it was seen as tantamount to a declaration of war. So what if you have countries X and Y, and country Y mobilizes, and its troops are right up to the border of country X, and country X then thinks, wait a minute, mobilization means they're going to war, and our plan requires us to attack them first. So we need to jump the shark here and attack them before they attack us. Otherwise, our plan's messed up. as silly as that sounds, and it very well may have been, that was the thinking you can see all across Europe. And so it may have then lent itself to a situation where this happened. Because what if country Y mobilized its troops not because they planned to attack, but because they were trying to defer an attack, like flex their muscles, right? So that they're trying to look tough to frighten you away so you don't attack. In the animal kingdom, they call this posturing. You've seen your house cat do it before, right? They arch their back and they hiss and their tail gets sort of fat, and that's all posturing behavior, basically trying to scare the other cat off. Now, cats, of course, will indeed fight, but they always try to sort of handle it by intimidating the other guy, beforehand, if possible. So, what if country Y had mobilized simply to try to deflect an attack, but by doing so, it put the country X in a position where we can't know, we can't wait. Maybe they're bluffing, but we don't have a choice, because if they're not bluffing and they attack us first, then we're screwed. Our plan is completely useless. So this is the way I think that there might be other ways too, but Tuchman sees, I think, possibly correctly, which is frightening, that an unwanted war could happen. Frightening in this day and age too, because we have nuclear weapons. So what if we can get to a point in a war where, at least at a certain point, everybody involved in the conflict, we don't want to go to war. Well, sorry, it's too late. Humans are now, it's like a machine that you've put on sort of autopilot, and you can't stop it. There's been movies, like science fiction movies, made about this kind of stuff before. But it does seem to be a possibility. Now we get to the crisis, the dramatic 37 days of wrangling and negotiations, diplomacy leading to war. This is actually from a fairly recent movie. You probably recognize at least a little bit of the cast there, about this exact crisis, called 37 Days. It's a 3-part, I think, hour long, so 3 hours long. This is well worth watching. If somebody wanted to watch even just one of the episodes of this for extra credit and write about the historical accuracy, I would accept that for sure. It's really well done. It's a bit hard to follow because there's a lot of back and forth, lots of characters, ambassadors from countries kind of coming in and out, visiting their counterparts in another country. But it's extremely well done, and you learn quite a bit about this crisis. Edward Grey, the guy that plays him, is in the picture on the left. Those are all British leaders. He's the one, the lowest on the that's Winston Churchill. So he's the one, the balding guy that's sort of standing the lowest. That's Winston Churchill. I forget where Grey is. He might not be in there. Anyway, it doesn't matter. These are actors anyway. The guy who plays Kaiser Wilhelm, you see in the middle there, he plays an over-the-top Kaiser Wilhelm in terms of just him being incredibly eccentric, which he was. So I actually think he probably nailed it, because the Kaiser was an extremely volatile and strange a man. So the designs and failures of individual leaders in national decision making. I'm going to keep this simple. That's why I sort of made this slide. Russian mobilization, once they mobilized their troops, as big of a country and military as they had, was seen as the ultimate provocation, and by a lot of historians is seen as the point of no return. There was no way to stop the war once Russia at least fully mobilized. There was something called partial mobilization too, but if you fully mobilize, that's maybe impossible to go back on. The foreign minister at the time, Sergei Sazonov, he was one of those that was very much talking and planning with the leaders about Russia's long-term interest in moving south to controlling the Black Sea Straits and Constantinople. France secretly conspired with Russia. They were an ally. They had been driven for a long time by revenge against Germany for the Franco-Prussian War, the taking of Alsace-Lorraine by Germany as part of the Franco-Prussian War, and the premier president of France, Raymond Poincaré, visited Russia just before all this stuff went down. So it does look like they were that Russia was looking at the possibility, if a war breaks out here, and we might be able to even nudge it forward some, we can sort of get a lot of what we've been looking at or trying to get for a long time, in another part of the world to our south. And France seems to have been willing to go along with that, at least according to Sean McMeekin, for a different reason, because they wanted to do whatever they could to get revenge against Germany. Germany's biggest mistake was trusting Austria and Austria-Hungary, who had terrible leadership during all this, particularly their foreign minister. But Kaiser Wilhelm, and it's not just him, but the buck has to stop at the top, so he deserves the criticism. But his Chancellor Bateman Holdweg is partially at fault as well. But when they heard about the assassination, and they were already allies of Austria-Hungary, they wanted to be, loyal allies and say, okay, we're behind you. That part you can't blame them for. They're saying, hey, you guys got assassinated, we'll back you up. But they just backed them up with a blank check, which is, hey, do whatever you need to do, and we'll support you. Do whatever you need to do, right? And then just kind of not even pay attention to what they are doing. That's taking a lot of risks, especially if your ally is incompetent. His leadership is incompetent anyway, and I don't know if the country can be incompetent. And they're not as powerful as you are. We saw in an earlier slide, in a related issue, that there's a possibility that when a smaller, less powerful country knows it has a big bully ally on its side behind it, it's likely to act more aggressively than it otherwise would. And the ultimatum to Serbia, these 10 demands that were, those were intrusive demands. You could look them up. They're very intrusive indeed. But you could argue that if they didn't know that they had the blank check in their pocket, that Austria wouldn't have sort of issued such a demonstrative and draconian ultimatum. So how could they have, the Germans, sort of let this happen, just say, we'll support you, and then just kind of let them do it on their own? No, we'll support you, we'll give you a signed check, but we're going to hold on to it until we see your policy. And then we'll hand over the check to you. Right? That would have been more prudent thinking. Austria-Hungary, its ultimatum was unnecessarily blunt, especially since its army wasn't even really ready to go. So it's like 48 hours, and if you don't respond, capitulate, we're going to start attacking you, but we don't have our troops ready to go in 48 hours. So this is a disaster waiting to happen already. So they're not prepared for military operations. Their foreign minister, Leopold von Berchtold, very German name, but he might have been the most incompetent person at a high level of this whole crisis. And of course, Great Britain, Sir Edward Grey, mentioned at the outset of the lecture, ignored the problem for way too long. Again, not just him, but this is his bailiwick, so a lot of it is on his plate. He left Britain's intentions, unclear, unstated, vague, for far too long. The Germans were desperately hoping Great Britain would sit the war out. And again, we know that Britain was prone to not living up to its obligations, so it wasn't unrealistic for Germany to think that it could happen. And it looked even more likely when day after day in this crisis, 37-day crisis, Britain failed to put out a statement saying, hey, if Germany keeps acting aggressively and Austria the same, we're going to get involved, better look out. They didn't say that. The decision to go to war, or even a statement that they might go to war, wasn't made until just a few days before the declarations of war, when the cabinet finally made a close decision to get involved in the war. Even if Sir Edward Grey and Great Britain had issued an official statement warning Germany, and they could have done it kind of vaguely, if this continues, we're going to have to look over all of our options, and it's possible we could get involved. Even if they didn't mean to, or they were just stalling for time until they made a decision, the Germans wouldn't necessarily know that, and so it could have had an effect in sort of cooling Germany and Austria's heels as well. So this was a major blunder. As I told you at the outset, Grey was certainly a capable leader, an individual, but this might have been the biggest mistake of all of the ones on our screen, at least at this moment. Russian mobilization, again, often seen as the sort of turning point or the point of no return. Nicholas II had hesitated and had once issued the order and took it back before it, the mobilization went through. But once it went through, again, historians are probably right in thinking that once they mobilized this virtually assured war, and really a world war, or a European-wide war, which turned into a world war. By the way, the Russians had always seen themselves as the protectors of the Slavic peoples, which included the Serbs. So that's why they're kind of involved here. And everybody knew they were going to be involved. Theirs wasn't so much a formal treaty of alliance with Serbia, but just this sort of long-term, kind of like we're your, big brother, going to protect you against bullies type of approach. And it wasn't so much that they made it sound that way in official statements and declarations that they cared about their fellow Slavs. I'm sure that's in there as well. But more or less what they're saying is Serbia is our backyard. That's our neck of the woods. You other European countries stay the hell out, and you stop messing with Serbia because that's our territory. So in a way, Russia was flexing its own muscles here for its own purposes. So was any one country to blame for all this? Norman Stone, in a book called Europe Transformed, says Germany held the key to all of this. Austria-Hungary was too weak to act on her own. So had Germany sort of slowed things down, not given the blank check, this whole thing might have come to a slowdown and then a halt. All historians now agree that each country, all of them, contributed to the onset of war. So nobody singles out one country, and that's certainly correct. All of them, right? All of them had problems with an aggressive nationalism here. All of them, right, were involved in the alliance system over the long term, and on and on. So all countries are culpable to some degree. However, the majority of historians believe Germany is the country most blameworthy. But even there are dissenting voices. Two of the most famous, Neil Ferguson, already quoted in a book called The Pity of War, holds his own country, this is home country, Great Britain, accountable. Though Ferguson's a Scot, so in some ways it might be too tempting for him to not take shots at the British government in London. The other that takes a dissenting position is Sean McMeekin in a book that basically says it all, The Russian Origins of World War I. And I've quoted McMeekin already earlier today. So he holds Russia accountable primarily for the war. I still think Germany probably qualifies because you can, and I won't get into it, but you can sort of dovetail an approach that sees Germany as still primarily responsible and fit most of what Ferguson and McMeekin are argued still within that fold. So they're not entirely wrong, but it still comes down to Germany. For instance, just one example, since we already kind of talked about this a bit, Russia may have had designs, its main reason for going to war might not have been protecting Serbia, but an excuse to get to Constantinople. Nonetheless, if Germany doesn't act aggressively and give the blank check to Austria and support them, no matter what, you probably don't have Russia getting the chance to do that anyway. So in some ways, I think it's correct to say that it did come down to what Germany decided. But there's no way that the war is completely Germany's fault. No historian thinks that. Keep in mind that this is not Nazi Germany either. We're not to the Nazis yet. Hitler was alive and he fought in World War I, but as a corporal, just an average soldier in the trenches. That's it. So this isn't the Nazis we're talking about. So, because sometimes when I say, well, the Germans are responsible for World War I, or at least partially, I think students hear that and kind of just nod their heads. Well, yeah, Hitler, the Nazis, of course they're responsible. Of course they're, guilty and bad guys. Well, okay, but this isn't Nazi Germany. Far from it, actually, at this point. Sean McMeekin says, I contend in this book, the one I just quoted above, that the current consensus about the First World War cannot survive serious scrutiny. The War of 1914 was Russia's war, even more than it was Germany's. That's his thesis. He makes good case for it. He certainly has convinced me that Russia did have these other aims that had nothing to do with the crisis in the Balkans.